What is the difference between a sketch, a body, and a component in Fusion 360, and why is that important? A sketch is one or more pieces of 2D geometry, like this rectangle here. If I go to Create, Extrude, or I can hit E on my keyboard for a keyboard shortcut, and I click that sketch, I can go vertical with it. And when I go vertical, I create a body. See, Operation New Body. So a body is what you think of as a solid model. It's a three-dimensional object. So what's the difference between a body and a component? A component is a discrete object in the real world. So if you're watching this video and you're holding a drink cup that's got a straw in it, that cup probably has two, maybe three components. The actual cup, perhaps a lid, that would be the second component, and the straw would be the third component. So a component is an individual or discrete object in the real world. Some components could have more than one body for a couple of different reasons. The bodies may not be touching each other, which means they have to be separate bodies, or more likely, take something like this coffee mug. You may have to model this by having a body as the mug itself, the center section, but then you may say switch into the create form sculpt environment within Fusion. That lets you create really cool organic features, and that may be a separate body to make this handle, but it's all one component because to me, as the user or the purchaser of this coffee mug, it's one discrete object. In this case, the handle and the mug body had been permanently fused together when it was fired. The same thing would apply if something is welded together. It may have different bodies in the manufacturing process, but for all intents and purposes, it's one individual object when it's done. So here I've got a component called Softjaw, and within that component is that body, but it's more than the body. It also includes the sketch I've used to extrude that body and its own origin or work coordinate system. I tend not to worry too much about this origin. That's not always so important. It is really important that when you create sketches, you put those sketches in the component. For example, let's say I want to add a shelf to this Softjaw. Notice I'm active on this Softjaw component. R for rectangle, and I'll sketch a rectangle, dimension it, 0.125, E for extrude, and we'll extrude that in negative 0.125. So you can now see my Softjaw component still only has one body, but that body has the sketch of the floor, where I extruded up the major part of the Softjaw, as well as the sketch up here that I used to create the indentation. It's important because as your parts get more complex, like this Geneva drive, you really want to make sure that your sketches were done in the correct component. In other words, I don't want to create a sketch to modify this gear, but have that sketch accidentally live in the component for this part over here. If you're not sure which is which, click on it. When you click on it, take a look at which item in the left has these new row of dots below it. See underneath rotor, get those dots. Same thing, I'll click on the blue gear, and you can see it expanded across, and then this component right here. When you start a new Fusion design, it's unsaved, so let's save it. Notice that this starts out as a cube. I recommend not creating a sketch now, but rather creating a new component. Watch what happens to our cube. Right-click, new component. Let's call this Softjaw. Our new component has a cube, but our file name up here, the parent, now has one cube and then something bigger next to it. I like to think of these as a little skyscraper. This is really important because Fusion is now treating this as an assembly. In other words, it's one file that can have multiple components. Remember, a component is a discrete object in the real world. So again, why does this matter? It matters mostly because when you go to create CAD files, oftentimes you're going to want to either machine those via CAM, or you're going to want to create joints under Assemble. Joints are what let you have things rotate and move relative to each other. You can only create joints between components. What's cool about Fusion 360, but different than other CAD software, is that all of these individual components are within this single file. Compare that with, say, SolidWorks. Here's an XY table that I downloaded off of GrabCAD. GrabCAD is a great website. We've actually got a whole video on using GrabCAD and other websites to find free CAD files. So the way SolidWorks treats this is they call them parts, but they're like components. I've got some 80/20 rails, some brackets, some motors. Each one of those components or parts is an individual file. So whether you're Windows or Mac or Linux, individual actual file, SLDPRT. And then in SolidWorks, we create this new file called an assembly file that links back to all of those individual components. Fusion doesn't really work that way. It treats everything like an assembly, so you can have all of your files within one. Makes it a lot easier when you're doing revisions and edits and parametric updates. One of the most common mistakes made is you start a new Fusion project and you just start sketching. And what happens is those sketches are stuck in the sketches here, which is really part of the parent. And let's say I wanted this object to be a component. Technically, this is a component because it's the parent file, but it's not really what we want. We want this to be a component along with many others. You can right-click the body and create components from body. That solves the problem, but unfortunately, the sketch is kind of stuck up here at the parent level. If you try to drag it into the component, usually you'll get a dependency warning. Not the end of the world, but I really urge you, create components from the start and label them, because so often, even if it's something simple like the file that we use to share our templates for CAM, it has a set of soft jaws, and we want those to be individual components. That way we can treat them differently in CAD and CAM, and we can create the joints for them to work. And it really stinks when you accidentally create your sketches at the parent level, which means the sketch for the soft jaw is not in the soft jaw, it's up here in the sort of wrong place.